Welcome to God Talk from your chaplaincy team at CCCU. So I'm really grateful tonight we have Fergus Butler-Gallie with us. I'm really grateful. Fergus is a very busy man, if nothing else keeping his Twitter account running. He's potentially the only person I've ever met that can call former Archbishop Rowan Williams a bag of Thai sweet chili crisps, amongst other things. But I can't do justice to Fergus. Not only is he a ordained member of the Church of England, he is also a published author, and I believe the class joker. So perhaps you would like to introduce yourself a bit, Fergus.
Oh, Pete, it's so nice to be with you, and most importantly, I'm a man of Kent, really, and it's nice to be sort of digitally joining you, if not physically, because to me it's a very special part of the world, and Canterbury in particular, a place I know well, and have great fond memories of, and I do think of myself really as Kentish. I've had to travel all over really for various jobs and things, but actually Kent is increasingly where I think of as home, actually. So it's very nice to be joining you, albeit, as I say, digitally, but yes, a sort of a taste of home via the computer.
Well, maybe when this is passed, we'll encourage you to come and visit us at the university and do this face to face all over again, which would be really good fun. How did you get to where you are, really, Fergus? I mean, you're, a relatively young man serving in the Church of England. It's perhaps not the obvious career choice for most people. So how did you get to where you are?
I mean, I ask myself that question every day, really, in a good way. I mean, sometimes in a frustrated way. You think sometimes you find yourself in situations in ministry when you're, in the midst of some chaos at a kid's thing or a funeral that's going wrong or something. You think, how did I end up here? And I suppose for me, there was no. I think people think to be, a church minister, to be a priest, to be ordained, you need a kind of burning bush moment, or a moment where you get this instant lightning bolt almost from heaven that says, God, I know that I need you now to do this. And I've never had that. I've never had that. I wasn't brought up in an especially religious household at all. In fact, not religious. We were christened as children, me, my brother and sisters, but I don't think my parents thought it would catch, so to speak. I think it was something they just did as a way of marking, as a social convention, as opposed to, I think, really due to any great desire that we would be brought up in the church. We didn't really go to church at all. Might go at Christmas to keep us entertained, when we were little, to sort of special children's services, but no real concept of church and God, which will come on to something I will mention later. I think people who grow up in Christian households, they're often surrounded by the paraphernalia, by books and the reality of religion. And I just wasn't. For me, religion was a historic fact rather than a day-to-day one. I was aware that people still went to church, but I didn't really know why. I didn't really know any of them. But I was always interested in history as a kid, I suppose, and it was through that I became interested in churches, in the places where people have worshipped God. And I think that's interesting because you can tell so much about a community. Particularly, Kent is well blessed with lots of beautiful and very old churches, and you go in and you think, wow, this is where the people in this little patch of land, and it might only be, even today, 200 people who live there, tops, sometimes fewer, 50. But since, for thousands of years, this is where they've come to bury their dead, to get married, to mark a birth, tragedies, blessings, joys. And for me, so churches were always, for me, I suppose, interesting places, even without a sense of God. But then when I was a teenager, I suppose I felt a sense. It wasn't, again, a lightning bolt, but I felt this vague sense that okay, I ought to try and understand religion, the ideas behind it. These places aren't just museums, right?
Yeah.
They are places where people go and they worship to this day. And I suppose I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. And again, the first time I went, I didn't remember coming away thinking, gosh, I know that's true. That's for me now. I'm a Christian. But slowly but surely, I found it compelling, I guess. And I was drawn back again and again. And there were some very kind and good people whose influence I owe to that. But there was also, I think, a sense, slowly but surely, that this was something I was interested in and something I felt I ought to commit to. Now, you mentioned before, in many ways, that's very different to the rest of the life I was sort of, leading. I had a lot of fun as a teenager. I wasn't always behaving especially well. I wasn't wild by any stretch of the imagination. But I was certainly, I was living life to the full, really. And again, I was always joking. And I suppose for me, there was always this strange thing that people think of religion as this very serious thing. It's got to be, and it's only for serious people. And there was me, class clown, suddenly deciding, well, you know what, I think this is something I am convinced by. And I suppose my whole life ever since has been that question of how seriously do I take it? How seriously do I take God? How seriously do I take the church? How seriously do I take myself? And how seriously do I take a world transformed in the light of what I believe to be true about Jesus Christ? So that question of how seriously do you take it chipped away at me, I guess. And I went to university and I studied languages and history. And I thought, I don't know, maybe I'll do something with languages, work abroad. And again, slowly but surely, I sort of had this sense, well, why not ministry? Can you give something? And again, I was lucky I had the right people pushing it. It's so important to have those people who say, oh, well, you considered that. And again, I thought my gifts are making people laugh. Certainly, I'm no great theological thinker. I'm no great, all the things you'd expect from a vicar. I don't know whether I necessarily do have those things. But people said, no, you have other gifts you can give. And I think that's the crucial thing to always remember, that there will be gifts there that God can use, no matter who you are, no matter what you're up to. And so, yes, I found myself being ordained by, becoming someone for whom ministry was a full-time commitment. And again, I still sometimes pinch myself. I still think, is this taking it seriously enough yet? Is this, have we reached an end point? And of course, the whole lesson there is that, of course, I haven't reached an end point. It's so, such a trite thing when people say, oh, all of it's a journey, but the reason why people say it is because it's true, right?
Yeah.
And the more you look back, the more you realize that what you thought were peaks were actually just base camps or foothills. When you thought you had things nailed down and sorted, actually they're leading you on to the next thing. So I can look back to events in my childhood or my teenage years and think, oh, at the time I didn't think in any way they were leading me towards God or ministry or anything like that. But you look back on them with a wry smile. And again, this is why I like to talk about humor and God so much, because the whole point of a good joke is you look back on it. When you've learned the punchline, you look back with a sense of knowing. You're like, oh, of course that's where it was going. Of course that's the structure of the joke. And I think the Christian faith is a lot like that, which is why I wish Christians would laugh more and be more joyous, I guess, because I think there's something really profound to be said there about looking back and thinking, okay, that's what that was about. And be that over the course of an individual life, or be that in terms of how we believe the universe and the world and the life of God to be structured. God lets us into the joke. I think that's the beautiful thing. So yeah, it's been a journey that I never expected, and I still to this day don't quite get it. And people are often surprised. I'm not an instinctively churchy person, I suppose, and yet, as I think we're probably going to talk about, I am, my expressions of my spirituality are very traditional in a number of ways. I'm not really at home with some of the perhaps less formal. Frankly, I am at home with formal religion, and yet I'm someone for whom informality and joy is part of who I am. And so I think you don't suppress one or the other. It's about the fullness of both. And I suppose for me, it's been learning that balancing act, right?
Yeah.
And learning that, like I said, that edge of where do you take things seriously, and when do you stop taking, when do you pull a little bit on this string and pull a little bit on that string, and in the end you end up with something you think, okay, this is where God may be leading me now. Does that make sense? Is that sort of
that makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering with the formal, whether that comes because you became interested in the Christian faith by trying to understand the communities that had gone before.
Yeah.
And very much one way of understanding that is understanding the liturgy more than the communities, which gives you a quite, or in my experience, and it might be different for yours, but certainly when I did it with a local church here, it gave me a very formal perspective of what the church did.
And I think it's important to remember that the root of Christianity is an understanding, right? That actually the boundaries of death aren't especially important. They are superficial, and they have been brought down by the person of Jesus Christ. So the dead have, there's a great, just because I happen to be alive in the here and now, why does that give me more of a say on the way things are in the dead? I will be dead at some point. And actually what Christianity says is that those who have gone before, those who are now, and those who are to come are not trapped in some sort of weird linear thing, but actually are all dancing around the throne of God in their own sort of way. And actually, if we view time almost as circular, with God in the center, we are orbiting it just in our different ways, as opposed to, this happens, that happens, that happens, and I'm at this point and I do what I do here. You actually see it as a much more holistic way almost. And I think therefore you then end up with a kind of necessarily a greater respect for the dead, and I would hope a greater respect for those who are to come as well. And I think that reflects on how we preserve our traditions. I think it reflects on how we interact with creation and the environment. I think it affects a million things, really. But having an idea that we don't just live this life here and that's it and that's done, and we are not, as the John Donne quote, no man is an island. And I think actually that's not just about the links we have to the people who we see on our, person we buy a coffee from, or, our friends who we see, or, the person I, nod to on the way to the gym or the bus or the, whatever. Those connections are important, right? But actually we have connections that we sometimes don't even know we have. When you kneel in the same place, if you stand in a church and you worship the same God, then you have a natural connection with those people, I think, who worshipped there, many years before, and you have a link with those people who will worship there in the future. And I think being more aware of that and the weight of responsibility it gives, but also it can be very freeing. I find it very freeing. It helps you then to not think of tradition, the past, or the liturgy or the traditional structures of the church, whatever, as like a weight on your shoulders, but part of your living whole. And I think that is a hugely liberating thing to then find yourself into, because it completely changes your dynamic with the past, because you're then in proper conversation with it rather than feeling it just accumulating behind you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm just thinking then, in terms of, I was really interested in what you said there about kneeling on the spot, and that really struck me, that point. I have to confess that I've never thought that at the altar rail, that there is a whole history that goes before me, even if the church building has changed.
Yeah,
it's the sacredness of the space, and as you say, the time. I mean, time is just a human concept, so in terms of incarnational time, there is no time, and therefore we're all in it. And I'm intrigued what you say there, because I mean, I've heard you preach a few times now, and I've been in various conferences where you've talked, and I know you're a great fan of the BCP, and if we can come to that.
Course, yeah.
But I'm wondering, just following on from what you were saying there, does this free you in a way that you don't feel you need to fit to a particular sphere of the church? That you see that more as a main construction? It becomes almost of a construction of power play rather than something useful.
I think
in the broader terms.
Yeah, I think that's very astute. That's a very good way of looking at it. And I suppose, yes, that we all have our own biases and our own preferences and things like that built in. But I think certainly, I think when you have a view of the church like that, and actually acknowledging that there are failings in the past and there are weaknesses in the past and there will be failings and weaknesses in the future, and actually the church on earth remains an institution filled with fallible human beings who will make mistakes. But actually, if you actually say, no, but I believe fully in the idea that this is a church joint with the church triumphant in heaven, that is joint with, when we make our prayers, we are making prayers at the same point as the saints and angels, to the same point, to the same God. It puts things in perspective, I suppose, in a way that if you're viewing these things again on a kind of linear level, I think it's very difficult to, when you're talking about the church on a sort of day-to-day basis and the political realities of it. Now, I can get as frustrated with it as anyone, but yes, I don't feel, I'm not a sort of party man in the sense that some people say, well, I'm an Anglo-Catholic, or I'm an evangelical, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative. I don't really. Those are not labels I find to be hugely constructive. I know what my liturgical preferences are. I know what my views are on certain issues. But I guess, yes, I suppose, I think a lot of it is about tribe, and tribe is a very natural thing to want to be a part of, right? You want to name yourself and root in an identity and say to other people, oh, I'm like you, you're like me, we agree on X. And Y doesn't agree with us, so they are in a different tribe. Now, that is comforting, I suppose. But I do think there has to be a sense where the identity that matters is in Christ. And as I say, I have plenty of other tribal identities, be that football team or a postcode or or a generation. There's a million different ways we're given these identifiers. And I think what the church does, ironically, is it says, okay, here's an identifier, but it's an identifier that sits outside of all that. And it's an identifier that actually, there's a glorious sermon, I think it's Ridley plays the Sermon of the Trumps, like a game of cards. And he keeps on saying, I know you play this card, you play this card, and then Jesus Christ is always the trump. And it's such a wonderful image for anyone who, I'm a great player of cards, I love playing cards with my friends. And the idea of Christ as the trump card, I think, is such a great image, because that be it in adversity or be it in success, that you have this sort of sense of something that is necessarily above and beyond, and yet also a full part and an endorsement of all those other things. So it's thinking of God and the church outside those kind of quite petty sometimes limitations of time and space. I think can be very liberating and can enable you to smile when something ridiculous happens, in a way that I think if you're too invested, sometimes it can make you very angry. And you see that in internal church disputes, in the way sometimes the church deals with people outside it. And I think actually a bit more confidence, ironically, in the reality of the church and the external reality and the greater reality of the church means you don't have to behave like that, because the fight is the battle is won. You can sit more lightly, I think, to these things, I would hope. Now, it's not to say things don't matter, and there are areas where one would want to be involved in the kind of discernment of how the church deals with things. But I think I always hope that the foot of the cross is a very good perspective point, and it puts an awful lot of other stuff in perspective.
I would just and one of the sayings I've always liked is when you talk of the liturgical dance. I quite like that, and I'm just listening to what you were saying there, and how the cross sits in the centre. And I mean that's very much for me. I think of Bonhoeffer. I think of Bonhoeffer's Christology, that the world evolves round the intersection of the cross with the physical earth that we live on. And I'm wondering whether, in essence, what you're talking about there is a liturgical dance, to use probably quite a bad energy, but if you imagine that Christ is the orchestra and the church dances round him, and in the same way that when you're dancing, although you have a set of steps you're supposed to follow to, sometimes you have to do a half step because another comes in or anything. And that's the changes we make. And sometimes I think we get too fixed that we have to follow these very specific set of steps, the 4-4-2 of a waltz, and you say, well, each step has to be exactly 30 centimetres.
Exactly, yes.
And we get too tied up with that and not tied up enough with the music and listening to the Christ orchestra in the centre.
Exactly. No, I think that's a wonderful analogy, and I think that's very much, I would say, how I would think of it. And then there are seasons for all things, aren't there? And there are times when we need to be to lose oneself in it is the right thing to do. But yes, if we become too, it is about, again, checking ourselves to balance. Are we that goes back to what I said at the start. Are we taking the right things seriously and taking the right things not seriously, if that makes sense? And where are we focusing our attentions, and are we doing that in a way that is true to the music that's being played?
So I know one of the things you take quite seriously, amongst things, if one can say that you take anything seriously, which is the Book of Common Prayer. So in your journey, how did the BCP come into your life? Because I'm guessing you're of an age where probably the BCP was on its way out. It wasn't the standard church text, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
I might be rude, but I'm guessing you were probably Series 1 ASB.
Yeah, so I'm certainly by the time I was going to churches, it was common worship. I'm 29 years old, so it was really, certainly by the time I'd set foot in churches, common worship had been in for a while. So I mean, for me, it's a funny story. It partly comes from being in a background where there weren't church, and again, this is what sometimes churchy people forget this, right? It's like when I'm a great opponent of the modernization of the Lord's Prayer, because people can go away from churches for sometimes for generations. I'm the first in my family for generations and generations to be involved in the church anyway, but they may come back. Yeah. And when they come back, to deprive them of that one link and say, well, we've moved on. And that one flame, that tiny flame of your faith that you kept going, that you may have had from childhood, that you may have had in very dark times, you may have prayed even as an atheist. The one little thing, we've snuffed it out because we're better now, and we know better now. And that little thing, and I think it's so damaging and dangerous. So in many ways, I'm a sort of living embodiment of that, just that continuity. And that in my family home, there weren't religious books. In my family, we're not buying all the new options of common worship every year, and putting all million copies of them in the bookshelves. There were a few children's Bible, there was a Noah's Ark storybook, but once I'd got to a certain age, there wasn't anything there. And I remember looking through some bookshelves at home when I was beginning to think about this, about God and religion, and about, is this something that's this is something that's sort of appealing to me. Do I know why? What do I know about it? And I struck across this tattered old book, really, in a red binding. I remember it's fallen apart now because I used it afterwards. That I saw was a prayer book, and it belonged to a kind of great aunt or something. It still had prayers for, I think, Edward VII and Queen Alexandra in it. It was old, and I just saw in it said morning prayer and evening prayer, and I thought, well, I've made this sort of come to this sense of belief, I'd better start praying. And so I simply just read what was there. And there were no, it's a deceptively simple book, the Book of Common Prayer, because it's not, there aren't a million different options of things you can do. It's not, if it's in the octave of X, Y, and Z after Easter, you have to use this red ribbon and flip back and do that, and the other. The words are there. They're there for the evening. They're there for the morning. And even if you don't quite understand how the psalm numbering works, which I didn't, even if you didn't know which Bible readings to do, then finding a Bible was a nightmare as well, because there were barely any of them around the house. I think I did find one in the end, but again, a King James, old battered King James version. But I just started praying using this. So for me, it then became the natural, it gave me this rhythm. And I certainly at the start was not committed every day or every evening, but I just knew there was this little red book that I could go to. If I thought, oh, you know what, I feel like I need to sort of pray this evening, I could go and I could say the words of evensong, the Magnificat, the Nunc Dimittis, words of the Creed, and they'd be there, and it became a great comfort to me. And actually the rhythm of it, that was simultaneously, there was a rhythm, it's saying, here is a rhythm of prayer for you to tap into that has been going for centuries. But in fact, it also was in many ways it was simple, it was relatively unchanging. It didn't require great effort from me. So what it became, I always say to people, is it became like a cradle for me. And I think that's the beauty of it, and that's what I've always found, that I don't, for me, saying especially morning and evening prayer, that's not something I do because I feel particularly struck with the zeal of the Holy Spirit in the morning. Quite the opposite. I hate mornings. I always have done. Always hated mornings. And I don't do it because I feel there's some sort of sacrifice due. I do it because I think the rhythm of prayer is profoundly healthy for me. It's profoundly healthy for my ministry. I think it's good for my mental, my physical health even. And I think it's good for the people around me, because I will pray for them as well. And actually what I want then is something that is going to give me a bit of rhythm, but also something that is authentic about the human condition. So why it appealed to me as a teenager, I think, is because I opened it and I saw, we've erred and strayed from thy ways from lost sheep, like lost sheep. We have followed too much the devices and desires of our own hearts. We've offended against thy holy laws. I had something that in its first chunk in the confession was being really honest about who humans were and who I knew myself to be as a teenager and as an adult, and what I could observe from the world around me, and didn't shy away from it, but didn't then present it in a way without any hope, but said, okay, this is what people are like. Here is a remedy. Here is still an excuse, a reason to rejoice. And so the simplicity, so those two things, I think that the rhythm of it and the authenticity of it, I saw in it immediately an analysis of the human condition that I thought, yeah, I recognize that, in a way that I hadn't done when I'd gone to church, and it had been very much, oh, Lord, you are so lovely, Lord, have mercy. Oh, we're really sorry, Lord, have mercy. I couldn't, I thought, I need something a bit deeper here. I need something that speaks a bit more to the realities of who I know myself to be, and what I judge the wider human condition to be. And so for me, that authenticity, and then you get that again in the Psalms. You get that, the beauty and the depth of those Psalms, and particularly in that translation, words that stick with you in a way. You've got to remember, this is, and people say this, they say, oh, the Book of Common Prayer is complex. It's not complex. It's not complex. The structure is incredibly simple. It barely changes. And this is liturgy, remember, that was designed to be memorized by illiterate post-medieval, farming communities. This is not designed for very intellectual. It's not designed to be read. It's designed to be heard. And that's what's really, really crucial. And so even if I'm on my own, I will often say it out loud. Not always, not if I'm on the tube. You don't want some people to give you odd looks, but I often will, even if I'm on it, and say it out, because it's those rhythms of language that stick with you. And as I've said before, no one will lie on their deathbed with a diocesan strap line on their lips. They might lie there with some of those words of the Book of Common Prayer, as many people have for generations and generations before them. And I think it is suicidal, frankly, for the church to say this is something we don't need anymore, because it taps into something that's a lot deeper that the church doesn't own. The church doesn't own the soul of people. And actually, when you have something like that, as I said, speaks of a rhythm in our lives that we may not even know is there. It's like that sort of hot water energy underneath people's houses in New Zealand. You know, we may not even know it's there, but it's bubbling underneath. And when you tap into it, you will know. And also something that is very true and authentic and speaks truthfully about the human condition. I think we'd be crazy to say this is something we don't need anymore. And I say that as someone who was brought to the church, someone in his 20s, who was brought to the church through exactly that combination of things that I've suggested. Now, you know, it may not be plenty of people's cup of tea, but the point of it is the rhythm. And actually, we owe people, I think, in this day and age, the two things lacking in so much that I see in my generation's life is authenticity, is the willingness to speak truth. Everything is about projection. Everything is about how things appear. Authenticity and healthy rhythms. You know, we live very erratic lives. We live lives where, you know, I can get food delivered to me in the drop of a hat. There's no sense of a healthy rhythm. And I think for me, discovering those two things have been, and finding them in that book, have been incredibly grounding and incredibly helpful, and keep me going on days when ministry is difficult, or when life more generally is difficult. I would say nothing less.
I would totally agree with you. I mean, my son is 14, very autistic, and struggles to read. And yet one of the very few books that he will pick up and read is the Book of Common Prayer.
Amazing.
Which is absolutely amazing. You know, you give him Jane and Peter school books that he's supposed to be able to read, and he struggles. And yet I've seen him with bishops debate the creed because he could read it,
because he knows it from there.
So I agree with you. There is a simplicity in it. But the more I use it, the more I appreciate Cranmer's language and the depth of it. And I think there's a depth that you can never fully appreciate with it.
Absolutely. It's carefully chosen stuff. You know, choosing the wrong word in Cranmer's day could get you, and in his case got him burnt at the stake. So these are not words that are there accidentally, and they're not used in a slapdash way or a lazy way. They're used in a way that's seriously thought through, and there are words that can ring and ring around your head for years and years and years, for lifetimes. I never forget a story when I was in South Africa. I went and did some teaching there about some elderly monks who'd been there since prior, you know, to the apartheid regime, and they'd been, you know, against, you know, they fought against the apartheid regime. They came through the other end into the 90s, and they were really elderly those by this point, and two of them at least, I think, were blind. And it was a story of them being driven from one part of the diocese to another to help with some ordinations or something. And one of them said, "Oh, what's the day today?" "Oh, it's 12th day of the month." "Oh, evening prayer." So they could just, there and then, they knew exactly what the Psalms were, and they just went between them. And at the end of it, one of them said something like, "Oh, I forget which Psalms are set for the 12th day. But you know what? I'd never thought about that verse like that before. But the motion of the car made me think of X, Y, and Z." And then they started having a theological debate. And I just thought it's such a beautiful image, that of these blind monks being driven through the hills of South Africa, using Cranmer's language back and forth, back and forth. And then one of them, even at the end of this long, long life, this long and fruitful ministry, still having a word that strikes him.
Yeah.
In a way that had never struck him before. And I just think it's such a glorious image. And I sincerely expect and hope that I will continue to be struck until my dying day, I hope, by aspects of those words. And as I said, they're carefully chosen. and well thought through. I think that's glorious about your son debating bishops as well. I think that's very good.
That was Bishop Michael Nazir from
yes,
Rochester.
Who confirmed me? Yeah, many moons ago.
He confirmed my son as well, and then my son.
Really? How wonderful!
He pulled him aside and said, "Well, why didn't you use the Book of Common Prayer? Why did you use Common Worship?" It's like,
brilliant.
Oh, really?
Oh, brilliant! Oh, well done him.
So I don't want to be rude, but there is obviously here a point of discussion. You are essentially, you read history at Oxford, if I'm correct now. You weren't born Christian, but you looked at the historical way that worship had happened, and essentially you stumbled across the BCP, and that was your entrance into the church. But a lot of people, certainly of a generation, and I would say probably around your generation and a bit younger, would say, look, actually, yeah, but that's it. You've come from it. You have an interest in history. You've come from it historically, and you would always say that. And this is what's going on with the church. And actually, what we need disco lights. We need a big worship band, and we need all of that, because that is how we attract a younger generation. What defence of the BCP could you possibly offer to that?
Well, I mean,
defence what you've already said, the fact that it has a rhythm, it grounds you, and it has a simplicity.
I would say what I think many people are crying out for, of all generations in this world, particularly now post-pandemic, are those things: rhythm and authenticity, both of which we see disrupted on a regular basis. Now, I'm all for creative ways to use the Book of Common Prayer. I did a video service for the National Church of England this summer that used it in ways that surprised a lot of people. And we had lots of sort of music you wouldn't expect, spoken word stuff, visual stuff that surprised a lot of people. And so I think it's important to remember it's a book that can be used creatively. It's not stuck in one method of thing or the other. But what I would say is that there are plenty of things I can get from the outside world very easily. As I said, I'm more comfortable in many ways. I'm not a churchy person, much more comfortable in the outside world, and I've spent plenty of time in venues with disco balls and flashing lights and loud music. But that's not for me. I don't need that, from the church. I can have a marvelous time getting that elsewhere. I'm a little old for it now, but there was a time in my life when that was something that I would engage with. But for me, I suppose I needed what I needed from the church was space, and I think that goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning. A space where I wasn't the biggest thing, and I think actually there's something about learning where you are within that history. I think is important for everyone, whether they are instinctively historically minded or not. I think knowing where we come from, knowing where we're going, knowing who we have links to, makes us better and more compassionate people. Necessarily, and I think it's part of the Christian journey. I think it's a necessary part of the Christian journey, and I don't think if your Christianity looks like it was made up yesterday, I think there's a problem there, theologically speaking. Now, much of it perhaps does come down to taste, and as I said, I think the prayer book can be used in creative ways outside the traditional. But I think what is worship there to do? Is worship there to, if it's not there to honor God, if it's not there to, and I said there to remind me of my relationship with God, and I think through rhythm and through authenticity, that's something that can be done. Now, as I say, that's not for me to say that that's impossible through bright lights and things, but I just, when the whole world is bright lights and disco balls, which a lot of it is, I think there's something to be said for something that isn't, and for space that allows you to just inhabit that space in a quieter, perhaps more contemplative way. Prayer I think is absolutely fine as a good and working. I would be very, very pro it.
I think there's certainly something there. I think the authenticity and the rhythm, and then going back to what you were saying earlier about appreciating that actually when you kneel at an altar or you sit in a church, even a very modern church building, that there are plenty that have come before you.
Absolutely.
And there will be plenty that will come after you. And you are just a fleeting moment in time, so to speak. And I think that actually sometimes finding stillness in that, and one of the things that I think we all struggle with in the modern world is finding stillness to sit with God, because lives are generally so busy.
Absolutely.
And I mean, we all know, any of us of the faith know that answers to prayer don't necessarily come instantly, that sometimes weeks, days, years, sometimes some prayers are never answered. And therefore there is also a benefit to slowing down in worship and not being so quick. It gives you time to not only listen for God, but to accept that divine time isn't your time.
Absolutely.
Use a statement.
And if we view worship as a sort of an attempt to conjure up a particular feeling, conjure up a sense of God, it will always fall short. Because there will be a time when that doesn't happen. So for me, it is about, it's about tapping into that which is above and beyond us. And again, that's for me to go back to what I was saying about that sense of cradling. There are days when I don't feel like even doing that. And actually, for me, then having something that is reliable and rhythmical, rhythmic, is profoundly helpful, because on those days when I don't feel like I can feel it, it doesn't matter, because I'm held by something bigger than me, and in this case, it's the liturgy, it's words, and it's always on those days when a line will come up in a psalm, or part of the Te Deum or the Magnificat will hit me in a way, and I'll think, that's why I was meant to use this on this day. And I think it's once you're in those rhythms, you begin to notice those things a little bit more. There's that great line from Temple when he was Archbishop of Canterbury. He says, "When I pray, I find coincidences happen. When I don't, they don't." And I think there is an element of that. And if we're just viewing prayer as wish fulfillment, then it's not going to work like that. But actually, if it's about us having these lives that are centered closer to God, rather than centered to all the weird and crazy things that the world would have us center them around, then I think we will find ourselves in happier, healthier, holier places than otherwise. Now, that's again not at the exclusion of the bright lights and the joys that are there on offer, but I think it's about balance again. Which things are you taking seriously? Which things are you not taking seriously?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point that we can wrap up our conversation. I really like to leave that on that question, and I think that's a question that people can go away and reflect on. What things are you taking seriously, and what things are you not taking seriously? So on behalf of the university, I'd like to express my profound thanks for you giving up your time, Fergus. It has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and one that I could continue a lot longer than time has allowed us, and hopefully one that we can come back to at a later date. So thank you very much.
It's been a great joy, and I look forward to, as I say, being in Canterbury physically at some point in the future. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us for this week's God Talk.